first three that we have here are Larry Solom, Rick Kay, and Hannah Ball.
So, Heidi, I would like to talk about the part of the chart that you omitted from your presentation, that is unconscious mental states. And so let me begin by saying I think that we have a vocabulary problem here, that if intentions are mental states, the relevant distinction is not between the conscious and the unconscious, but between occurrent and dispositional mental states. And I'd like to suggest that almost all of what Larry and Emily say that you focus on is consistent with the notion that the relevant kind of intention that we're talking about here, the semantic intentions that people have with respect to the meaning of their utterances, can be understood as dispositional mental states, right? So dispositional mental states sort of have a certain resemblance to hypothetical intentions, G on your charts, but they're not hypothetical, they're real mental states that actually exist. So you have two arguments in the paper against this view, and I'd like to suggest that neither one of these arguments is satisfactory. So the first argument you make is the Freud argument, right? That the problem with the idea of unconscious mental states is that we're now engaging in some kind of Freudian enterprise. And I'd just like to suggest that that was mere rhetorical hand-waving. That wasn't an argument at all. Obviously, we can have a theory of dispositional mental states that cash out meaning that doesn't rely on anything like Freudian psychology. Dispositional mental states are familiar to modern cognitive science, right? So there's no mystery here. Your second argument on the following page is an epistemic argument, right? You're arguing that because of the problems of group intentions, we would lack the ability to reconstruct dispositional mental states, right? And you have this lovely quote. I love this quote from Gray, right? It's just a beautiful quotation. But I'd like to suggest that really Gray is absolutely wrong here. That we do in fact have rich information that allows us in normal circumstances, not in all possible circumstances, to access the dispositional mental states of others. And in fact, this is what we do all the time when we understand other speakers. We have lots of information, rich information about their general psychological construction, the environment in which they exist. And so there's we have rich information about sort of the mind-world relationship that allows us to make pretty reliable inferences about these underlying dispositional states. Now, of course, it can go wrong. It does go wrong, right? And so misunderstanding is possible. Right? Of course, and we're all familiar with cases in which we've misunderstood someone because it turns out that the background experiences they've had have led them to have a dispositional mental state that's aberrant, and that we had no clues as to whether or not this sort of unusual meaning existed based on what they said, and then we discover it, for example, in dialogue with them that they have misunderstood some word that we, based on their behavior, thought they did understand. So what I would like to suggest then is that Larry and Emily have a perfectly good theory available to them, and that theory is defeated by neither of the two arguments that you made in the paper.
You know what, I think I'm going to just break from the rules for a second, since that was such an extensive comment, and see if you want to say anything in response to that before we go to the other.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you very much for that. I was sitting here wondering how I was going to hang on to three.
Yeah.
So the challenge back, of course, Larry, is what's a dispositional intention or mental state? What do you mean by a dispositional mental state? And I know what I would think I would mean if I used that phrase, but of course I'm going to construe it one way or the other way that's going to put it into one of the other camps. But what do you mean?
So a dispositional mental state, it would seem to me, and I don't have a full-fledged theory, right? But a dispositional mental state would consist sort of as a set of dispositions, right? That is of regular tendencies to respond in certain ways. It's a mental state, right, which means that it's a state of the mind supported by underlying brain processes. So we have lots of dispositional mental states are very familiar. This particular kind of dispositional mental state is a disposition to react to your environment in regular ways with respect to the applicability or non-applicability of a given unit of meaning, whether that be a word, phrase, right, clause, etc.
Okay, so the first thing I'd say is, that wasn't very clear. First thing I'd say is, sure, people have dispositions, and one wonders whether they really are mental states and whether one can lay claim to them by claiming their familiarity. What one really thinks is that dispositions are ultimately behavioral, and we can, of course, track behavior back to mental states. But what I would suggest is that ultimately, of course, what we're doing when we're moving from people's behavioral dispositions, coupled with words they use that are in some manner in need of interpretation, is that what we're doing is a form of rational reconstruction. We take everything we know about their behavior, we take their words, and we rationally construct what they effectively would intend if they were either rational agents or agents capable of commenting, so that they put their past behavior together with their present words for us, but we're doing it for them. So one version of what a dispositional mental state would be is simply our attribution by rational reconstruction of a meaning of something to them. But of course that doesn't mean they intended it in any sense of that word that is other than a rational reconstruction. The alternative, of course, is that we're appealing to goals we know they have. We're appealing to background motivations and background goals that we know they're pursuing. So in the case of the bears, I mean, I don't know what it would mean to look to dispositional mental states for help with whether or not somebody who passed a prohibition against bears within 1,000 feet of a residential area intended to include Malaysian sun bears when they never heard of them. And I don't know what dispositions are going to help me with that, and I don't know what dispositions could possibly have as their content the fact that the lawmaker intended to include or exclude Malaysian bears when they never heard of them, right? So I'm either going to do some rational reconstruction, it's just a reason to by analogy, but that's not really to do intentionalism, or I'm going to appeal to the background goals of the person who banned the bears and say, what were they after? If it was safety, then pandas are out and maybe Malaysian sun bears are in. That's not intentionalism either, certainly at least not on Larry's account.
Okay, Rick and Hannah.
One could ask but I want to stick to one, which is the kind of the consequences of your position for what the special role of legal texts in the administration of our legal system. That is, having abandoned the intended meaning, what role is left for legal text once we've disconnected them from a particular lawmaker or the intentions of a particular lawmaker? Why do they now still commend themselves to us as reasons, as bases for action? And the suggestion which you come to towards the end of the paper is, and one which Stanley averted to, is that kind of just on their face, the texts are capable, may be capable of helping us work out our moral responsibilities, which I'm willing to accept. But having accepted that, one then says, well then, what is there about these texts that particularly privileges them in that regard. If I want to work out my moral responsibilities, why don't I go to the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius instead of to the California Civil Code, or to the Confessions of St. Augustine, for that matter. You do make a reference at the end to kind of democratic, the kind of virtues of democratic formulation of laws, but whatever virtue that process has seems to me to be a virtue of the deliberate use of kind of mental states by the actors involved in the formulation of a certain text, and that's exactly what you are closing off to us in the legal interpretation without intentions. So.
At the risk of sounding anti-philosophical, I have to ask whether all these distinctions really matter, because I think the very goal of language and debate and discussion when you're creating a law is to bring all of these different possible ways of defining intent into alignment. I mean, you're trying to get at least A through F on the chart here to lead to the same answer, and that's why we discuss and amend and refine. And then additionally, to bring at least H in, you want the text that you come out with to further the goals and motivations that you have in mind. So the whole point is to get all of these to line up to the same thing. And the fact that sometimes it doesn't work and we make mistakes doesn't necessarily mean that language is incoherent. I mean, that would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And additionally, to the extent that it does come out pointing to different answers, generally, I guess we'd have 2 or 3 different possible answers, not one for each possible way of defining intent. That seems to me like a pretty good description of the range in which a judge is free to choose what he thinks is the best interpretation, rather than just looking for the one definitive right answer, because in that case we don't have a definitive right answer. So in that broader context, I'm not sure why we're spending so much time trying to figure out which one of these points is the right way to define intent.
Would you like to?
So 2, okay.
Yeah. We're going to do the rule of 2 now.
The rule of 2, okay.
It's not a rule of 2.
Must be a rule of 3. Okay, so Rick, the role of legal texts, once they're disconnected from intentions. Of course, in some sense, this is to ask me for the paper I didn't write, of course, and the theory not particularly articulated and defended here. But I'm certainly happy to say that it seems to me that morality is complicated, extremely difficult and textured, and the result is we have every reason on moral grounds to seek secondary principles with which to simplify it in many instances in which largely achieving coordination, for example, is more important than anything else, or achieving an answer is more important than achieving the best answer. So in lots of instances, what we clearly need is simply coordination devices, and law provides us with just that. And it behooves us to have a salient source of coordination solutions, themselves just salient solutions. So we have every reason to construct so-called governments that pass laws that serve these coordinating functions, right? And so the text can, in many instances, serve moral purposes simply by providing us with salient coordination solutions to our coordination problems. And that's a vast amount of our law. There are, of course, problems that are not mere coordination problems, but rule of law values are real values. Morality really, in my view at least, makes it the case that it's a virtue for people to be able to rely on future consequences to their actions and be able to predict the consequences, and for judges to be able to decide like cases alike. And for that reason, we'll have lots of good grounds to have secondary principles that are articulated and cleave to so that we can protect rule of law values of liberty, equality, and fairness that depend on settled texts with fairly settled meaning that change incrementally over time so that we protect those values. And Hannah, that's a big question. Do all these distinctions matter? Because isn't it the case we want to align all of them? It would be really nice to do all. It would be really nice if if everybody always meant by their words what their words mean, and if those happily always serve background goals that people were sought to advance, and that those goals were in line with our best moral theory of the day. The problem is, law is rich in examples where those things come apart, right? So take this famous torts case, the Toddler versus Ullman case that's in the paper, where, the woman complies with a law that says walk always against traffic when you're a pedestrian on a road. She comes to a blind curve. She crosses over so she can see oncoming traffic better, so as to protect her own safety, and of course is hit by a drunk driver. And then he claims per se negligence because she violated a law requiring her to walk against traffic. It's perfectly clear that the language is exceptionless, right? And its drafters may never have intended an exception. They may have never thought of an exception. The background goal, if it's a goal of safety, though, is well served by not treating her as contributory negligent under the circumstances. So we can generate any number of cases in which we can tease apart these variables. And then we're going to continue to say to intentionalists, so which of these do you really mean when you talk about intended meaning? Because those are going to trump the rest in instances of conflict.
Well, I agree with that analysis of your example. I just wanted to speak to a single word in Hannah's question, which is the word best. I was chugging along very nicely with you until you got, as I'm sure you'll be extraordinarily pleased to hear, until you got to best, and you said the best interpretation. Now, I can't make any sense of the word best there, because I want to substitute for it the word correct. What you want is the correct interpretation. What is it that these words mean? What is it that those who designed, produced, encoded, so forth, them wanted to communicate? Now, the best interpretation, presumably, is the interpretation that would best accord with some other goal that you might have, some goal that was part of our concern for government or the administration of justice. Now, that interpretation might, of course, be preferred to the correct interpretation. And since that sounds so odd to say, let me amend it. It might be the case that the correct interpretation is not particularly interesting or useful in relation to your goal. Therefore, what you might decide to do, and this is what is done a lot in the law, is abandon doing interpretation. Now, abandoning doing interpretation, and then usually pretending rhetorically that you're still doing it, is a lot of what goes on. So what I want to do is divorce correct from best and suggest that the abandoning of interpretation may be something that we decide to do, and then we should be aware both of the benefits we hope to derive from it and the costs that we may be paying in order to do it.
Okay. Well, okay, now we will have three, I guess, this time. And I'm inserting myself as the first, and then we'll have Don Drips and Mike Rappaport.
Larry is also there.
Oh, it's Larry. Okay. So Larry's going to have to wait to the next trio. Because my question does sort of grow out of this exchange just now, so I wanted to put myself in here. There is a difference. There are lots of differences between the views that Heidi's expressed and Stanley's view, of course. But it strikes me that in one way Heidi is more like Larry, at least as she has represented him here, what I think is accurate in this respect, and that both of them may be opposed to you, Stanley, in what you've just been saying. Because Heidi interprets Larry as trying to propose, Larry and Emily is proposing a theory of interpretation that is sort of attuned to some sort of normative purpose, or Larry can reject that, I guess, if he wants to, but definitely Heidi interprets it that way. Whereas you've made quite a strong point of saying, what interpretation is one thing, and whether it's normatively desirable and so forth is a different thing, and you're not making claims about that.
Right, quite right.
Now, your position worries me just a little in this way, in a couple of ways. One is that it might seem to be, it might at some point seem to dissolve itself or contradict itself, since lots of people do talk about interpretation and intend it to mean things other than what you mean. So, if interpretation, is determined by the intentions of the people who use the term, lots of people are using the term intending something other than what you say it means, I think. The other concern is just that it might sort of trivialize interpretation. Now, you might rejoice in that, I think, but the response would just, I take it, one response might be, say, well, okay, then let's just say that all these arguments that we've been having about constitutional interpretation should be described with some other term, and interpretation is you using it as one possibility, and other people advocate other possibilities. And if you want to insist that interpretation means that thing, then those other people now will have to just rephrase and say, well, then they're not advocating constitutional interpretation, but they're advocating constitutional interpretation /1 or something or other, and then the debates would just start up again, and we wouldn't have made any progress with respect to any of those debates. So that'll be mine, but that's my question. But we'll have Don and Mike.
Fine. This is very quick. What about computer-generated texts? So, for instance, I'm playing chess on the internet, and I type in E4, and my opponent types back C5. And now we're playing the Sicilian defense, and I know exactly what that means. And I know what that means whether my opponent is a machine or a person. Does that text not have any meaning when it's generated by a computer? And if not, how does the theory accommodate that?
Mm-hmm.
There's not so much really a question as just an attempt to sort of get a little bit of clarity. And I think one issue that always arises here and has arisen here, particularly with Stanley's comments, and this is something of an echo of what Steve said, is we've got certain theories of interpretation which are just that. They're theories about what words mean or the theory of interpretation. They're what I call a positive theory. And that's how I know Heidi interprets Larry differently than I normally interpret him. I normally see him as just having a positive theory. And there's a bunch of people out there who are thought of as originalists who I think of as falling in this camp in the main, besides Larry and let's say Cy together. Gary Lawson, a completely different theory, but just positive theory. And I think Larry Solom's work has mainly just been positive theory, although he talks about the possibility of normative theories. And so these are just sort of positive theories out there, and they're often called originalists because they think the meaning of the document is the original meaning, however we determine it. But there's nothing more about whether we ought to follow the document. You could easily see moves that people could make from that point, but they don't tend to make those moves. And then, of course, there's a bunch of theories out there that are kind of normative theorists, and we could just sort of it's a hodgepodge of people, but Keith Whittington and Robert Bork and Scalia and my own work with John McGinnis and I think Rick Kay. And all these theories actually have both an interpretive theory, which says this is what the meaning of the words are, and then a sort of separate normative theory that says, okay, well, we ought to follow the interpretive theory. The interpretive theory tells us that the meaning is this original meaning, and then we ought to follow the original meaning for various reasons. Whittington is a popular sovereignty theory. Scalia is about clarity. My own work with John McGinnis is about good results coming from the supermajoritarian process. So it's just sort of helpful to realize, I think very often in the literature it's just not recognized or it's just sort of glossed over that there's just two different things going on, and some of the problems are just, confusing that people are trying to do two different things when they're claiming to be originalists and they're claiming to have sort of interpretive theories.
Well, some of those at least were directed more at you, Stanley.
Let me just try it. Okay, look. First of all, I think that was a great point, Mike, and I think that the distinction between positivist and normative theories is extremely important, and that I hope you would rank me along with.
You're right here. Did I leave you off?
The two Larrys in this respect. And another way to put this is that positivist theorists, intentionalist theorists, are deliberately, even defiantly, and in my case, even gleefully minimalist. I say, you think this is going to be of any help to you? Nah, forget about it. And so the obvious response is, so why do you spend so much time, why do you come to all of these conferences and say the same damn thing over and over again? And the answer is because people don't yet realize, and a sufficient number of people don't yet realize that I'm right. And in fact, the reason that I entered this field at all is because there is a question, both in the legal academy and the legal world, where I now reside, and the literary world where I used to reside, and from which I avoid you all to avoid, which I urge you all to avoid as much as possible. In both these worlds, a big question has been, what is the meaning of a text, or what does a text mean? And the answers that are given in both areas, both fields, are pretty much the same. Text means what its words understood either historically or in terms of dictionary embedded in a syntax means. Text means what its authors intended it to mean, or a text means the Rorty thing. A text means what we can, in fact, see it to mean given our present purposes and concerns. Those are the three. So my interest is just to say that the intentionalist answer to that question is the only rational, coherent answer. I don't need, and this gets to another question, the first question, I don't need, that is Steve's question, I don't need the word interpretation. You want to do away with the word interpretation? Fine. And I'm fully willing to acknowledge that in history, current and including current history, interpretation has been used in very, very, very many ways. So you might inquire, as people do in intellectual history, what is the meaning of the fact that in the late 18th century, fewer and fewer epic poems were written? Okay? How do you interpret that? Well, that's a question. And it is, in some sense, an interpretive question. But it's not a question about what any of these epics, either written or the ones that didn't get written, mean. And that's the only kind of question that I'm focusing on here. Now, as for the computer-generated text, the answer is that the text's author is the person who set up the program. That's it. The text author is the person who set up the program. If, in fact, no one set up the program and it's random, then you can consider yourself, A, extremely fortunate to be in this unlikely conversation, but B, you are mistaken if you are proceeding as if it were a real one.
Well, now we're actually going to go back to two. We did every other one, I guess. So we have Larry. I thought of calling on Larry early on since he was sort of the target, but figured he didn't raise his hand and let him have the benefit of some criticisms, and now he can give his response. And then Laurie Klaus.
I just wanted to resist, Steve. You tried to drive a wedge in a certain way, and I separate out the normative and the positive. I think quite clearly. So the question of what the meaning of the Constitution, the thing that was done in the late 18th century by people whose identities we know and circumstances we know, that meaning, so I say their intended meaning, and it would be so. I mean, we could imagine that we have replaced the U.S. Constitution with something else, some other Constitution now, adopted in the year 2011. The question of what that 18th century document meant, however, now it has no normative force for us, right? It's like the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution of the Confederacy. It's there, it still has a meaning. I mean, we can still ask, as we do about the Articles of Confederation or about the Constitution of the Confederacy. It would be odd to have a living version of the Constitution of the Confederacy, are interpreting it to be the best it can be in the Dworkinian kind of way. Those would be very odd enterprises. I mean, it's not that you couldn't do that, but it'd be like playing in a certain way, right? But there is an empirical question. What did that mean? You know, what did the people who drafted that mean? And that's the way we normally approach historical documents that are not normative for us, what, you know, some Civil War piece of correspondence meant or something like that. We want to know about the author and what the author's intended meaning. Now, there is a normative side, you know, which is the question of you know, we have these authorities that we tell the legislature, it's your job to come up with laws, to come up with what we're supposed to pay in taxes or what we're supposed to do. Now, one of the things that connects the two is that if we assume that they're the ones who are going to come up with the norms that will bind us, now, of course, we can resist that, but if we assume that, then when they come up with a bunch of symbols, which is their medium for telling us what norms they came up with, the sort of natural thing to do is to say, well, what did they mean by those symbols? I mean, we could give those symbols a whole bunch of other meanings, but it then makes the whole process of having a legislature come up with this seem rather silly. And I always analogize this, and I apologize to people who've heard this one before, to what I do when I'm trying to assemble a child's toy. Get a child's toy for Christmas, and then it comes from a foreign country, and the person who wrote the instructions for assembling didn't speak very good English. And so I'm sitting there trying to figure out what I'm looking at that awful diagram and trying to read the instructions and what I'm assuming is my project is to find out what they wanted me to do. And so I'm not going to, and sometimes if the language is mangled, I'm going to do my best to figure out what they intended to mean by that, even though if it had been written that way by someone else, it would have meant something entirely different. But that's irrelevant to my project here, which is trying to figure out what the norm is for assembling this toy, and they are the ones who have given me the norm. So there is a normative side, there's an empirical side. The normative side is, whose norms, whose construction of norms is going to bind me? Whose do I care about? The positive side is, once they come up with an attempt to communicate those norms to me, how do I read the symbols that they produce? And that's the positive side.
Laurie.
Right. Oh, Stanley, I want to take you back to your dinner table. And let's imagine that you've got an exchange student who's just arrived, sitting there from a foreign country, who has no English language knowledge at all. And you say, and this kid, along with your child, is doing things that you disapprove of, and you use the same words to this kid: stop playing with the dogs. And you may indeed succeed with equal efficacy in conveying your displeasure to this other child as you did to your child. But the words you used would be doing zero work in that situation, absolutely no work at all in getting the child there. It would be all about tone and manner. Now, but the point of law, isn't it, is to generate words that do work in our community. Whatever we may happen to know, whatever evidence we might happen to have about any particular contributing person's intentions, and the work that they do comes from the fact that these words have a pre-existing communicative efficacy in our community, which individuals, participants in the community, are accessing. Sometimes they're on the margins shaping, if they're Shakespeare or Sarah Palin, but mostly they're accessing. And we have this strong reason to want this process to occur, namely the predictive efficacy for our community about the behaviour of each other, regardless of any theory of authority being right or wrong. And therefore, isn't this a coherent sense of public meaning?
No, but you're right up to that last sentence, which is pretty good.
Yes. Also, this may be very much related to Laurie's question. Let me ask it a somewhat different way. You separate out very sharply intentionalism and textualism, but in some sense, you might in the talk have suggested why there might not be quite as sharp in practice a separation. I mean, for instance, intentionalism in law could be a kind of vulgar understanding if we actually thought that private people's intentions actually mattered. The intent, the less vulgar understanding might be that, well, their intention was they intended, they understood that this was a legal document, they understood that this was part of a legal, continuing legal enterprise, and they intended to tap into all sorts of legal rules, all sorts of legal understandings that might actually give the text primacy in a variety of contexts. And in that way, to separate out vulgar intentionalism from something like Milton's sophisticated intentionalism, you might actually structure something that with its rules of interpretation looks not unlike that of public meaning, so long as one insisted on the primacy of the intent to bring along those rules. And so there could be perhaps within that discussion some way of bringing peace to the warring factions of originalists.
Okay, so now let me just say we have about 10 minutes left, and we have 3 questions or comments that were just made, and a couple more people on the queue, so I just want you to know that, and if Heidi or Stanley would like to respond to any of these questions, please do so.
Just very quickly, I mean, of course, embrace the sentiment of the last speakers. And this notion that it seems to me that the virtue of words is precisely that they release us from the task of having to read minds, and that's the remarkable triumphant value of language as a form of communication. It would be extremely odd to get a note in a bottle as one's sailing around the bay, and the note in the bottle says, "Help me, I'm a castaway on Lost Island, and here are my coordinates." And I would say, I have no idea what that means. I'm not going anywhere. I can't decipher that this is even a language because I can't possibly know who intended these things to know what language to read the note in, and therefore I'm certainly not going to start sailing toward Lost Island to rescue them, even though there is a Lost Island, right? I mean, that would be very odd. It's very odd to think that we can't interpret Shakespeare unless we can figure out who exactly Shakespeare is if it was one person, or that we couldn't interpret, words on the wall of a cave, hieroglyphics that is, because we can't track down the folks who we would need to mind meld with. So, I'm fully in sympathy with this notion that words precisely release us from this task, and as a general matter, people mean what their words mean, and happily that allows us to both communicate and build institutions that advance our ability to live together. And,
I think you overstated what both Laurie and John said. Because I feel that by putting both Laurie's question and John's addendum or expansion of the question together, that you do get the kind of peace that you, John, were promising. For the following reasons, I fully agree that in many contexts, including the context of writing and promulgating laws, what you want to do is harness yourself to public standard, conventional, word meaning, sign meaning correlations. You want to do that. And you want to do that for reasons of communication, predictability, all of the reasons that have been said. That, however, rather than being an argument against intention, is in fact merely a version of intentionalism, because what it says is that you, that is the lawgiver or judge or city councilman who does harness herself to standard public meanings, is doing so as an intentional choice. I intend you to hear me and to read me in the light of public standard meaning correlations, and that, in fact, in most and indeed many conversational and reading contexts, is the default assumption upon which we all rely and which I am relying on right at this very moment. That, however, does not mean that the words that I am uttering or that the words that a lawgiver might promulgate can be read independently of intention. They're just being read within the intention, within the assumption of my intention to harness myself, to deploy public meaning correlations. What I think Heidi keeps on doing is slipping back, although this would not be her description of it, of course, of returning to a form of textualism which assumes, and here I'm going to use a term that Larry uses in order to argue against it, that words declare their own meanings, or that even, more faithful to what Larry has said often, that words declare themselves as words. In order for language to, in fact, be received as language, one has to assume an intentional agent, a purposive agent who has produced these words. And there are so many examples that I will not bore you with of situations in which, after having discovered that what you thought was a set of words, that it was in fact accidentally produced by rain marks or something, so that, to use a phrase that Heidi does use, it only resembles language, then it seems to me that to interpret that, again, this is a point that Larry makes in his paper, is to perform a very odd and bizarre act, because what you're interpreting is not something that was in fact the bearer of any message to you. But the main point, going back to John and his attempt, I think successful, to bring peace, is that there is room, more than room, in an account of intentionalism for public meaning, so long as public meaning is regarded as an intentional choice and not as an a priori constraint on intention.
Well, I think we have time for at least two more questions, not answers, so I'll keep that in mind as you ask your questions.
We've talked.
John Harrison and Mike Paulson.
A little more on what public meaning might be. There is a provision in the Civil Rights Act of 1991 that says that the exclusive legislative history in interpreting this provision shall be the following document. Fact one. Fact two, there is an author of that provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1991, not me, but I know who it is, and that person's identity is, as far as I know, generally not known. If you think about those two facts, constraint on information either by its unavailability in general or by the authoritative lawgiver saying, don't use some information, do you have B, C, and D? Is that what B, C, and D are? They are like A, E, and F, except with less information. And so for one thing an intentionalist can mean by public meaning is the information-constrained version of intent, and maybe that is interpretation or maybe it's not, but maybe you're doing something other than interpretation that's like interpretation but with deliberately less information, but doing it for a reason.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, I was going to have asked essentially John McGinnis's question. I think you guys have persuaded me that what I call original objective public meaning, whole text and context, meaning the word, it is actually just a species of intentionalism. I know.
Man, that's great.
But let me ask the question this way. This kind of builds on John Harrison's question. Is from an intentionalist standpoint, who do you understand to be the authors of the Constitution?
Well,
that's an empirical question.
We have a couple minutes before a commercial break, so as Bill O'Reilly would say, I'll give the two of you the last word.
Now, that's an empirical question. That is, one of the things that intentionalism, as I have laid it out, and as Larry and others lay it out, is that it doesn't give you either determinate answers to the questions that you want answers to, and it doesn't even tell you who or what the intender is. So again, I return to the fact that it is absolutely useless. The only thing that the intentionalist thesis has going for it is that it is true.
Heidi, you want to...
And really quickly back to John. Yeah, I would say that most textualists are going to be down in that lower right-hand corner, right? They ultimately think, to the extent that they're intentionalist textualists, the intentions they attribute to the framers or the drafters or the authors of the text in question are intentions to have their words interpreted in light of what their words mean, not in light of their own subjective concepts or exemplars. Now, of course, there are people who think you ought to interpret texts according to the natural kinds named by the words therein, but not because their authors intended you to do so. That's somebody like me, right? That's a natural kind, moral realist, interpretivist who's not down here. Right, they're not down here. They're up with Aquinas' spirit or something, right?
They're also the people that Plato made fun of in Cratylus.
But I'm an Aristotelian.
Well, thanks very much. So, Stan and Heidi.